Good morning and thank you for tuning in. So I've been married for quite a few years now, and it's funny how you change over time. And me and Yasmin joke about this a lot, but when we first got married, I was really pretty home economically challenged. I didn't really know how to wash clothes. I couldn't be trusted to, separate the whites from the darks. I wasn't real keen on washing dishes. I could sweep, but I didn't know how to mop. And I wasn't very good about keeping the house straightened up. And so anytime Yasmin would go on a trip or even just go out for the day and I was left at home, there was a 50-50 chance that she would get back and I hadn't done any kind of straightening up or anything like that. And she would react accordingly. If she came back and I had been in the house all day and I hadn't straightened up at all, she would be pretty frustrated with me. The nice thing is that over time I've learned to do all of those things except for the laundry. You still shouldn't trust me with the laundry. I can do it, but I don't feel real confident doing it. But everything else, I can sweep, I can mop, I can vacuum, I can do the dishes, I can even dust. And I actually look forward to making the house look good for her before she gets home. Like if I'm at home and I know she's going to get back later on, I make an effort to make the house look good because I know that her reaction is going to be one of gratitude and thankfulness and love. And so I gave you, I'm not just trying to, pat myself on the back. It took me a long time to learn to be a decent husband. But Jesus tells this story, it's not a story, he gives us imagery of the way that he wants his disciples to wait on him. And of course, in the context, they don't really understand where Jesus is going or why Jesus would even give them these kinds of instructions. But, if you fast forward after Jesus' crucifixion and his ascension, all of this starts to kind of make sense. And Jesus really wants them to be prepared and to be ready for him to return. And these words are so relevant to the day and age that we live in today. And so I just want us to pay special attention to what Jesus says here and see what kinds of things we can be reminded of. See what kinds of things we can learn from this and put into practice. And so Luke chapter 12, verse 35, Jesus tells his disciples, "Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes." So Jesus is talking to his disciples, and the imagery that he uses is one of servants. And these servants staying back at their master's house while the master is gone to a wedding banquet, a party, right? And Jesus emphasizes that the servants need to be ready for the master to come back. They need to be prepared for their master to return. They need to have everything in order and ready for his return, for his arrival. I think about this and Jesus kind of relating his disciples with servants, and I think about how immediately off-putting this would be to any would-be Jesus follower who thought of themselves as, extra special or, abnormally important. Any would-be Jesus follower who held some kind of position of power or authority or control, being called a servant, being called a slave is a little offensive, right? And I mean, even in our context, we don't like to think of ourselves as servants or slaves. It's not a positive thing. Our society, obviously looks at slavery as an evil, and yet we are to be Jesus's slaves, Jesus's servants. And so this can be a little off-putting when we first read it. You have to at least be willing to think about yourself in terms of a slave or a servant. And that's a challenging thing to do. In fact, maybe right now, just in this very moment, ask yourself, am I a disciple of Jesus? If I'm a follower of Jesus, do I think of myself as one of his servants? Do I think of myself as a slave of Christ? Paul called himself that. Do we see ourselves that way? Well, Jesus encourages us here to do just that, to see ourselves as servants. And servants who are waiting for their master to return. And of course, the context that we live in, post crucifixion, post-resurrection, post-ascension, we are literally waiting for Jesus to come back. We are waiting for Jesus' second coming. And so this is a really good description of who we ought to be. And here's the right mentality. The mentality that we should have while we wait. And so this is what we do while we wait. We don't wait passively. We're not just kind of sitting around for Jesus to come back. We're also not to be focused on living a regular worldly life until Jesus comes back. I got a 9 to 5 and I got a retirement and I got a family, and that's my life until Jesus comes back. Jesus calls into a life where we got a job, we got a family, we live in a neighborhood, we've got neighbors, we've got friends, but we also don't lose sight of the bigger picture, which is this reality that Jesus is coming back. Here's how we're supposed to wait. Jesus describes his servants as being dressed. So have you ever been in your pajamas, maybe like on a Saturday morning, and somebody came over and they didn't call you or text you before they came, and you go and you answer the door and you're thinking, who is this? And you're like, oh, I'm still in my pajamas. This is kind of embarrassing. Jesus encourages his servants to be dressed, to be prepared, basically. And he says, ready for service. And so, ready to serve the master. When the master asks for this, ready to say, okay, you've got it. When the master says, go do this, ready to jump right in. And so Jesus tells us that's how we need to be. We need to be dressed and ready for service. We also need to keep our lamps burning. I like that imagery. This imagery of it's dark out there, but in here we're keeping the lamps burning so that there is light. That could refer to just our behavior. Let's live our lives in a way that we reflect the light of God into dark places by keeping our lamps burning, by continuing to do good works inspired by Jesus. But one commentator, he reminds anybody reading his commentary that keeping a large home, these are his words, keeping a large home illuminated in the first century required tending multiple lamps. And so we kind of think of keeping the lamps burning as just this simple, you make sure the lamp is lit. But it was this constant process because a large household would have maybe, 20 or 30 lamps all over the place. And so you would have to make sure that there was oil. You would have to make sure that the wick was adjusted. It's active work. In our lives as Christians, we need to be paying attention to our light and making sure that indeed we are reflecting light in the way that we live. And so we need to keep our lamps burning. Jesus also says that the right mentality for his servants is to be ready to immediately open the door. And so the imagery there is, I think, you don't want to keep, if you're at the White House and the president is coming and you're the doorman, you don't want to keep the president outside in the cold. In the same way, if I know that Yasmin is on her way home, I unlock the door just so that I know that she, if she's got bags in her hands, she's not stuck outside. Jesus is coming back, and we need to be ready to welcome him back. And so what that means is this mentality that we are aware that he could be on the threshold, that he could be at the door. And so we need to be ready to open the door and celebrate his return as quickly as possible. And then finally, Jesus also says that it will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching. And so not just that we know that Jesus is coming back, but eagerly waiting for his return. And so that idea that we're not just, oh yeah, Jesus is coming back, but that we're saying, oh yeah, Jesus is coming back, woohoo! We're looking forward to it because it's a good thing. And so, waiting on somebody to return, you can either be kind of dreading it. If you haven't picked up the mess in the house, then maybe you're not looking forward to this person coming home. But if you're ready, then you're excited that they're coming back. And that's what Jesus wants his servants. That's the mentality he wants them to have. And so, in essence, if we boil all of that down, Jesus is just saying, be ready. Be prepared. And so I want to ask you that this morning. Are you ready for Jesus? We talk about this sometimes. Jesus could come back at any moment. That's true. But are you ready for it? Are you ready for Jesus to come back? Hopefully this gets us thinking in terms of maybe thinking about it every day. Jesus, if you come back today, help me to be ready and excited and looking forward to that. Well, Jesus goes on and says in verse 12, truly I tell you, the master, he will dress himself to serve and will have them, the servants, recline at the table and will come and wait on them. And so this is a really unexpected kind of twist in the imagery that Jesus is giving his disciples. He says that if the master comes home and sees his servants ready and waiting for him, then the master is actually going to have them sit at the table and he's going to serve them. He's going to wait on them. That is a role reversal. I don't know, in the first century when Jesus, is talking to the disciples, that probably had never happened before. In fact, the people hearing Jesus talk about this would have been like, what? That's unheard of. Nobody's ever, no master has ever served his servants. But of course, Jesus is different than worldly kings. He's different than worldly people of authority. He's different than worldly masters. He's a master who loves his servants. He is a king who loves his subjects. And he's humble. And that marriage of love and humility means that Jesus wants to wait on us. He wants to serve us. He wants to show us his gratitude and his love. I think that's a really powerful picture because even in our day and age, it's not something that we see very often. And when it does happen, when we see somebody in power and authority humble themselves by serving somebody or doing something kind for someone, that touches us. Here, the person with power and authority uses that power and authority to love and to serve. That's who Jesus is. That should amaze us. That's who Jesus is. For Luke, writing to Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, who most likely was somebody who had some kind of power and authority, this was challenging. It was challenging to look at Jesus in power and authority, giving that up to love and serve people. and Luke kind of pushing that part of the narrative so that Theophilus would understand that in his own life, in whatever sphere of influence he was powerful in, he needed to use that power and authority to love and serve others. Well, Jesus, kind of shocks them by telling him that. And in verse 38, he says, "It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or toward daybreak." And so it might be, you don't know when he's going to come back. It could be really, really late. Maybe when you don't expect him. And that's how Jesus will return. But here, things get a little bit darker. Verse 39. "But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." You're going to be taken by surprise. If you know that somebody's going to break into your house, then you're going to call the cops, and you and the cops are going to be there waiting for them. But robbers and thieves don't give you a heads up when they're going to, bust out your windows or knock down your door and come steal your stuff. And in the same way, and it's weird for Jesus to use this illustration, Jesus the thief or Jesus the intruder, but the idea is that you're going to be taken by surprise. And that's why I think sometimes this whole part of Christianity that wants to read the signs of the times and look for new prophecies to try to figure out, is Jesus coming? You're putting too much effort into that. Jesus says it right here. Just be ready, because you're not gonna know when he's gonna come back. And so instead of spending all your time trying to figure out when he's gonna come back, spend all your time being ready for him to come back. That's the work that Jesus is calling his disciples into. And so in verse 41, Peter asks Jesus. Maybe everybody was wondering this, but Peter asked the question, "Lord, are you telling this parable to us or to everyone?" And Jesus answered in verse 42, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, 'My master's taking a long time in coming,' and he then begins to beat the other servant." So it's like there's a hierarchy, and the servant that's in charge of the other servants is mistreating the other ones. And so Jesus, or maybe this might be alluding to or referring to the Jewish religious elite, the high priest and the priesthood, and maybe even to a certain extent the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Instead of using their position to feed people and help people and serve people, they actually end up mistreating them or hurting them. Then this is kind of accusatory, right? And even I think for Christian leaders, this has relevance to us. We need to make sure that we are loving and serving and feeding and helping instead of falling into the trap of the Pharisees, which is, lording it over people. And so Jesus goes on and says, if the servant says to himself, "My master's taking a long time in coming," and he then begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, to eat and to drink and to get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him and at an hour he's not aware of. This is pretty brutal. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. So you begin to kind of get the sense that Jesus is talking to the religious elite of his day. And maybe even alluding to their judgment. And these passages where Jesus talks this way, they're not easy to interpret. But there are things here to be learned, and that is that in our waiting, we can wait humbly, lovingly, willing to serve and ready for Jesus to come back. Or in our waiting, we can just kind of have the mentality that let's just use this time for us to do what we want to do, for our pleasure. Let's basically just eat, drink, and be merry until Jesus comes back. And a lot of people, that's kind of their idea, is that, the world's going to end, maybe Jesus will come back, if God is real. But until that happens, if that happens, I'm just going to live my life. I'm just going to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, as the saying goes. But Jesus is saying, there's a consequence for not living ready for his return. There is a consequence for not paying attention, for not being ready, for not keeping your lamp burning. And the consequence is dire. That might be a part of the Christian message that in recent years we have felt less and less able to kind of speak publicly because of the criticism that we are judgmental, or that we don't love people. But it's actually more loving to tell people about the coming judgment than it is to withhold that truth from them. And so it's important that we don't just kind of push this message, this part of Jesus' message, under the rug and not talk about the judgment. But what we want to emphasize is the reality that Jesus is coming, and that's a good thing if you are one of Jesus' followers. And so we want to encourage people to become followers of Jesus, to embrace the kingdom of God, to embrace the gospel message. Verse 47, the servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready, or does not do what the master wants, will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with few blows. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. And so the whole idea there is just, we know that Jesus is coming back. And so if you know, don't live like you don't know. That's easy to say, but it's hard to do. We can fall asleep. We can get distracted. There's so many things, politics, right? Money, our jobs, our careers. Even seemingly good things can distract us from this reality that Jesus is coming back. And so let's not let that be a truth that sits in the back of our minds, but let's let it sit at the forefront of our minds. Let's let it kind of dictate how we're going to live our lives on a daily basis. Let's finish this passage quickly. Verse 49, I've come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Jesus is looking at the reality of his crucifixion, and he knows that baptism, that trial, that death is coming soon. And he wants to get it over with, right? Verse 51, do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. From now on there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Jesus says, my message, the message of the gospel, the message of the kingdom, it's going to divide people. And that's still true today. The message of Jesus still divides people. Jesus did come to bring peace on earth, but peace comes after judgment. Verse 54, he said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, it's going to rain. And it does. So Jesus says, you guys know how to read the weather charts. You know how to look at the sky and you can kind of guess this is what's going to happen based on how the clouds look, right? Here comes a rain cloud. I guess it's going to rain. And when the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot because it's going to push all that hot air up towards us. And it is. So Jesus says, good for you. You can do that. But then he goes on to say in verse 56, hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? So Jesus is saying, man, you guys, You know how to interpret the weather, based off of the signs that you see. But the signs that are right in front of you, specifically me, I'm the Messiah, you're missing it. You're missing the point. And I think he's probably talking to the greater crowds at this point, not necessarily his disciples, but he's saying, don't let this sign pass you by. And I think that's kind of the message that we want, the desperation that Jesus feels we should feel for the world. Jesus is coming. Now is your opportunity to turn to him. Turn to him now. Because there's going to be a storm. There's going to be a judgment. Verse 57, why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? And as you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversary may drag you off to the judge, and the judge may turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Basically, Jesus is saying, now is the time. Now is the time to repent. Now is the time to make amends. Now is the time to get right with God. Now is the time to embrace the message of the kingdom. Because there will come a time when you won't have time. And you'll be thrown into prison. That's a big message this morning. So two big things there. Let's be ready for Jesus to come back. And let's be joyful about the fact that he is coming back. But also, let's tell others that now is the time to embrace Jesus. Now is the time to turn to him. And let's love and serve people so that they have an idea of the kind of king that we want them to serve. And the kind of king that wants them to be a part of his kingdom. Blessings.